Submarine, the autobiography of Simon Lake, as told to Herbert Corey. Forward. Perhaps no man in the past century has had as much to do with the shape of history as Simon Lake. That statement is intended as a query rather than a statement of fact. It may be debatable, but is also defendable. He is responsible for the modern submarine. The World War pivoted on him, not on the Kaiser or Lloyd George or Hindenburg or Wilson or Ludendorff. He had nothing to do with the provocations or the settlements. He was an engineer almost unknown except on the coast of New Jersey and in a few capitals of Europe. His sympathies were not warmly engaged for either of the parties to the conflict. Not until the United States entered the war was he greatly stirred. Yet the pinch-pine boat he stitched and screwed and nailed together as a boy rattled a mighty empire. Great Britain's crown as Queen of the Seas almost slipped off her imperial head. If she had gone down, France must have gone with her. The consequences of such a collapse are now incalculable. Today's world may have been no worse than it is, but it must have been almost insanely different. The brutalities of submarine warfare aroused the generous and sentimental people of the United States. Americans had no cause to love Great Britain, except that they traced their bloodlines to quiet villages in the shires. A synthetic affection for France had been built up through the complete misunderstanding of the part France had played toward us. We were drenched with Allied propaganda, and the German side of the case was muted. Yet we would in all probability have been able to maintain an attitude of detached partiality if the Germans had not turned barbarian with their submarines. It was Simon Lake, the almost unknown engineer on the Jersey coast, who was wholly responsible for the submarine. It is not fair to say that some other man might have done what Simon Lake did. The fact is that there was no such other man. The modern submarine stems from his pitch-pine boat as surely as the oak does from the acorn. There is no one to share his distinction. When we entered the war, the Allies were beaten. No candid person, conservant with the facts, will attempt to deny that now. The Americans reinforced the faltering Allies with men and money and munitions, but more than all with a reckless courage and an unthinking prodigality and a complete disregard for obstacles. They did not follow the rules of war, but they won their battles. Germany was defeated primarily because Simon Lake's submarine brought us into the war. The part we took in the World War cost us $40 billion, more or less. After being a Santa Claus, the United States became a Shylock to the eyes of our unwilling debtors. A boom based on inflation was followed by a collapse due to deflation. Ever-rising taxes galled a people who had hardly been tax-conscious before the war. Social unrest, the mouthings of demagogues, appalling extravagances by money-drunk officials from village to capital dangerously strained the American political structure. A weakened and uncertain America lost something of its power to aid and comfort a frightened and confused world. Behind a screen of submarines, Japan felt competent to defy other major powers when a sprawling China seemed again open to attack. Italy, armed with submarines, was able to assert a claim to the Mediterranean as her sea. France and Great Britain were reluctantly forced to embark on a great navy-building program. Pirate submarines clandestinely aided Franco's rebel forces in Spain. All over the world, the little powers on the edge of the waters added submarines to their coastal defenses. In past days, a rusty cruiser armed with a few light guns could set such little powers shivering in their boots. The submarine has redressed the balance. Elaborate protections are now required to ward off evil-smelling, clanking, rattling, slimy little sea vipers. They are deadly dangerous and they are comparatively cheap. Simon Lake, no other man, is responsible for these changes in the form of history. He found the submarine a bouncing, uncontrollable, suicidal, useless craft and made it into the arm most feared by the world's navies. In more than 40 years, he and he alone taught it to dive and steer, shaped its hull, gave it eyes, put its guns on turrets, and arranged such a compromise between comfort and exhaustion that its crews are able to keep the seas. Of the 111 patents he took out for incorporation in the modern submarine, 25 are today in use in every submarine in the world. No submarine can make a voyage or see the enemy or fire a gun, or live for that matter, except by using the lake patents. The protective period has long ago expired, of course. No royalties are being paid, but they are the blood and veins and sinews of the dark monster that has literally and in fact upset a picture whose background was roughed in when men invented gunpowder. Lake sees the $50 million battleships of today as ponderous steel houseboats, which provide dancing platforms for Navy night and luxurious suites for admirals, but are quite useless in wartime. Not merely useless, but an actual drain on the resources of the country which must man and paint and in wartime protect them from the submarine. He foresees submarine navies, provisioned from submarine depots, silent and invisible. He anticipates trade routes furnished with submarine cargo and passenger carriers, and voyages made under the ice to the North Pole, in comfort and safety, so that no schoolgirl need suffer, and possibly romantic ventures to the depths of the sea where may be found a lost continent. Do these things seem absurd? Then read that great marine engineer, after opposing some of Lake's plans, finally conceded on his own defeat. Your gadgets are all wrong according to the books, he said, but the dickens of it is that they work. It may be that he did not change the course of history. It is possible that the Germanic powers would have been defeated and that the United States would have entered the war if no one had ever heard of undersea boots, or torpedoes, or the Lusitania. The evidence is that he did. And he invented and improved his submarine creations in the face of every obstacle, impeded by his own government, so hard up at times that work once stopped because he could not pay a $17 debt, opposed by every brass-hatted official, horrified by meeting a new idea face to face. He was robed and laughed at, humiliated, and in the end, triumphant. He has made fortunes and lost them. He could refuse $2.5 million offered for his signature to a blind contract. He could spend the summer trying to find a lost treasure ship. He refused to buy the top of Signal Hill, under which more oil was hidden than in any other dome recorded in the story of the great petroleum adventure, and has never worried a second about the pocketful of millions he lost. He made a door-to-door canvass in New York for the backing he could not find, and refused a Russian contract that promised an immediate fortune because he could not endure the Muscovite morals. He is a stubborn and puritanic and persistent and modern person. It is doubtful, on the whole, that anyone in this world has ever had a better time. If the scales were balanced, it is probable that the submarine would be found to be an instrument of mercy rather than of murder during the World War. It made the bombardment of coastal towns a gamble in which the dice were cogged against the bombarders. If the command of the seas had rested on big ship power, thousands more men would have died. But the big ships were not risked. Not every submarine commander was a foul savage at heart. Most of them gave the stubbornly brave seamen who navigated rusty little slow steamers laden with food toward British ports a chance to escape with their lives. The submarine was slandered after all, but not because it was an illegal weapon, every nation accepted it, but because it endangered England. But Simon Lake's place in history does not depend entirely on his creature of the dark waters. It is only that the submarine has been his most spectacular creation. Of his 1,500 patents, I say 1,500, not even Simon Lake could give the number offhand. Others are perhaps quite as important as the 111 that have to do with a submarine. He found an idea in an old powder horn and made it into an airlock, and that airlock made New York's under-river tunnels possible. He improved the old breakneck high-wheeled bicycle by giving it a safe steering gear, and that gear keeps the automobiles of America out of ditches today. Patents for fabricated houses antedated all others. Else how could he have gotten patent papers? Because he had no time to give it. He neglected a plan of treatment by vacuum which may be claimed as an ancestor of today's iron lung. He has preserved an extraordinary simplicity of manner. Short, inclined toward stoutness, gray-haired, he peers at the world through his right eye. When the left eye must be called on, a drooping lid is propped up by a wire frame that has an effect of a monocle. The eye is sound, but the muscles were injured while he worked of his periscope. He chuckles at merry recollections. He has never found it necessary to be profane. Men obey well enough. It does not fret his dignity to explain an order. If he has been wrong, he is delighted to be put right. Men who have been with him for a length of time call him Simon. He detests scrimshakers and bellyachers. He belongs to the old school in which men who were paid their debts and did not argue that a world can waste its way out of misery, and who worked hard and saved and valued possessions less than self-respect. The two compliments he seems to have valued most came from an Austrian admiral and an American mechanic. For 25 years, Popper had been the chief instructor of the Austrian Navy. He had designed a submarine of his own and was about to build it when he met Lake and talked over plans. Later he said, "You may be interested to know you happened to get your first order from Austria." Lake was interested, of course. "I went to Emperor Franz Joseph," said Popper, "and told him about you, and asked permission to give you a contract. I said, 'His boat is better than mine.'" He recognized the mechanic's voice through the hangings of a restaurant booth one night. A newly hired man wanted to know about his new boss. "What kind of man is Lake to work for?" "I'll tell you about the governor," said an old hand. "We go to hell for him." Chapter 2. Invention Runs in the Lake Blood. Jules Verne was in a sense the director general of my life. When I was not more than 10 or 11 years old, I read his 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and my young imagination was fired. This generation may have forgotten that Verne was a great scientist, as well as the writer of the most romantic fiction of his day. I began to dream of making voyages under the waters, and of the vast stores of treasure and the superb adventures that awaited subquaneous pioneers. But with the impotence which is a part of the equipment of the totally inexperienced, I found fault with some features of Jules Verne's Nautilus, and set about improving upon them. This was not the complete absurdity in fact that it may seem when set down in black and white. There is a strong strain of inventiveness in the lake blood. Tools run in our bloodstream, and drawing boards and calipers are household necessities. Before I was 9 years old, I had taken my stepmother's sewing machine completely apart and put it together again, and it ran better than it ever did. My father was a watch repairer in his off moments. For that matter, he was anything which had to do with tools. In his little workroom, he had a saucer filled with spare parts for watches, new and old. "May I work with them?" I asked one day. "Don't lose any," was his permission. I put together a watch which not only ran but keeps time accurately today. Its only eccentricity is that it will only run while lying on its back, due to the fact that the one balance wheel I could find had been intended for a watch of an entirely different caliber. Possibly the fact that during my earlier school years I was something of a belligerent pariah, and was therefore cut off from the normal contact with my kind-shaped likings. But in any case, I always preferred messing around with tools to playing with the youngsters of my age. Drawing plans to scale was as much fun for me as solitary sailing in my boat. In 1881, we moved to Toms River, New Jersey from Philadelphia, and for a time I lived a charmed life. I sailed my boat, drew plans, worked with tools, and so far as I can recollect, was not interfered with at all. So as long as I obeyed the household rules, meal hours, and bedtimes. I had been so excited by Jules Verne's Nautilus that I began to read everything which might have a bearing on the problems attending my proposed penetration of the depths of the sea. It was at this time that I studied Steele's Natural Philosophy and learned of the diving bell. It was perhaps natural that the kind of boy I was, I should draw plans for a submarine which have a diving compartment. That early submarine of mine was the predecessor of all the submarines there are on the seas today. Until the paper accoutrement of my Argonaut, no one had invented a submarine which could submerge with an even keel, instead of progressing in the distressing hops and bounds which had made the first attempts at submarining impracticable. My Argonaut could be driven under the water for an indefinite period, which is more than could be said of any other proposed submarine of the day. It had wheels in which it can run along the sea bottom as readily as an automobile can traverse a paved highway. They demonstrated their practicability later by obtaining for me a rich contract with Russia. My plans for the Argonaut included an airlock, which was the first practical application to my knowledge of this principle in connection with a diving bell. Verne's Nautilus had been provided with a diving compartment which could be opened to the sea, but which was manifestly inconvenient and dangerous. I added an intermediate airlock and devised an air pump by which the air pressure could be raised in the diver's compartment until it equaled the hydrostatic pressure of the water outside. Then the diver's door could be opened, and no water could enter the compartment so long as the water and air pressure equaled each other. The intermediate airlock permits the occupants of the submarine to pass back and forth between the living quarters of the submarine, in which the air pressure is always maintained at the substantially normal atmospheric pressure of about 15 pounds per square inch, and the diving compartment, in which the air pressure must be increased 0.433 pounds per square inch for every additional foot the submarine submerges when the bottom exit door is open. One can spear a fish, or scoop up crabs, or walk on the bottom of the sea with ease as long as one keeps one's head in the air-filled compartment. I knew nothing of the bends in those days. I doubt if anyone else did. They were the deviltries of later days, when high air pressure became the rule in working in caissons and in New York's underground river tunnels. My little Argonaut had been planned for only submersions to a shallow depth in waters around Tom's River. The original designs called for wooden construction throughout and manpower on the gears that drove the propeller, but it carried in every important development in submarining which in the past half-century has been seen. I do not suggest that someone else might not have seen the possibilities later, but only that I saw them first. Years later, Charles Suey Smith, head of the Foundation Company of New York, said to me, "I got my idea for using the airlock in driving caissons for foundations and in building tunnels under the river from your early work. Much obliged, Simon." In turn, I had my idea from some forgotten lake who had hunted deer, and perhaps Indians, in the same country around Tom's River. Among the innumerable things of doubtful utility which had been little by little accumulating in the household was an old powder horn. The man who had first boiled and scraped that horn had had a turn toward artistry, for I recall that it was covered with ornamentation, scratched in with the point of a hunting knife. One day, when I was completely stuck with my airlock plan, I knew what I wanted, but I did not know how to get it. I picked up this old horn and began to fiddle with it. The small end carried a curious double charger, the like of which I had never seen. When it was pressed down, a charge of powder ran into it from the horn, and when it was full, the flow was automatically cut off. That gave me the idea for the airlock. If it had not been adopted by modern submarine constructors, there would have been fewer losses of life in submarine disasters. It is quite feasible for the crew of a helpless and sunken submarine to reach the surface through the airlock if the proper escape devices had been provided. The old powder horn recalls an incident that is perfectly incredible. No one can believe it, yet I am sure it is true. While my father was in the West, following the death of my mother, he had picked up an old cap and ball revolver. It was a sort of blunderbuss affair, carrying an enormous round bullet and with a hinged ramming mechanism attached to the side. I had found it during my rummaging among the plunder in the attic and promptly commandeered it. It had its part in the games I played with myself, and when I could get enough money to buy powder and shot and caps, I would go hunting with it. In order to forestall any possible objections, I hid the old revolver under the front porch, and then I forgot about it, and when the hired man quite accidentally found it on one of his cleanup expeditions, a household panic followed. "Burglars hid it there," said our womenfolk. "We will all be murdered in our beds." That this did not make sense is perfectly evident, but the to-do persisted until I came forward and told my story. My interest in hunting was reawakened by the return of the old gun, With some difficulty, I got hold of ammunition for it and went hunting. Exposure to the salt air of the Jersey coast had ruined it, however. The barrel had almost plunged with rust, and its other parts in it were in a decayed and ruinous condition. That meant nothing to me, for ballistics had never been one of my preoccupations. I loaded it with a full charge of powder and shot and aimed it at a bird and fired. The old pistol blew up in a shower. Bits of it rained down all over me. The bird witness of the explosion fell dead. No one will believe me, but it is a fact that there was not the tiniest mark of any sort on that bird's body. It must have been literally scared to death. It could not have been more surprised than I was a little later, however. My Uncle Jesse had taken a fancy to me, and I spent a good deal of time in his workshop. One day I was hard at work with a foot punch. You placed whatever it was that you wished to punch in the jaws, and then stamped on the foot treadle. Just as I was about to stamp, Uncle Jesse called me. "What are you making, son?" he asked. "A thing for my boat," I replied, punching hard. His question had taken my mind off my business. The punch went through the gadget and my forefinger, too, and held fast. I called over Uncle Jesse. "I can't get my finger out." "Why don't you take your foot off the treadle?" he said. The doctor said that my finger would have to come off, but my father would not listen to them. It was saved after months of bandaging. It's nothing to boast of. My natural resentment at this accident was tempered, however, by the fact that it relieved me of my daily half-hour of piano practice, on which my stepmother had insisted. I had precisely the same amount of liking for the piano that any growing boy who prefers to spend his time in the open air when he is not fooling around with tools. I figured I was well ahead of the game. My Uncle Jesse was a remarkable man. He was a seafarer by preference and kept 2 schooners constantly in commission. Between times he ran his foundry and a farm and did inventing on the side. He had an old treadmill on the farm, which was operated by horses and furnished the power for various farm operations. One year he got a contract to build a road across a patch of swamp, but ran into difficulty when the ground was so soft that he could not haul his wagons over it. So he sat down to think. "I'll just turn the old treadmill upside down," said he. He did it, and it worked. The horses worked the treadmill, and the cleats on which they climbed marched over the soft mire and hauled wagons behind them. It would be difficult to overemphasize the importance of this almost accidental discovery. It was the precursor of the Caterpillar tractors that are in use everywhere in farm and road-making operations, and a theory without which the tanks used in modern warfare would be impossible. Later he built a steam-driven tractor locomotive, which pulled a whole train of gravel cars. This was used to build the first highway from Pleasantville, New Jersey, to Atlantic City, a distance of about 5 miles across a soft swamp that had hitherto been impassable. He sold to Cyrus McCormick for $1,500 the device for lifting the cutter bar of mowing machines over stumps and stones, which made the mower a really practical article. One day he found even a more powerful winch with which to pull his schooners up on the ways, so he made one which had never been excelled. He was as sure as his winch as Archimedes was of his levers. Give me a place to tie, and I could pull the earth and moon together. Uncle Jesse invented the whistling buoy and anchored the device on Sandy Hook for a trial. It was so successful that someone took the idea and got a patent on it. His inventions were not always so practical. One year he invented shoes with which to walk on water. "We'll try 'em out on Fish Creek," he said. My father and Wesley Lake went with him to a place on Fish Creek between Pleasantville and what is now Atlantic City, where he tried on his shoes and started for his stroll. They worked all right. He was getting along just fine until he turned his head to look at something and capsized. Uncle Jesse was held head down in the water with shoes on top until Father and Wesley rescued him. He threw the shoes away. Uncle Jesse and Uncle Ezra invented a flying machine which had at least a hint of practicality in it, for Ezra flew in it, but he picked the wrong place for his flight. He set it up in one gallery of the Pleasantville church and undertook to fly across the church and land in the opposite gallery. He flew, but he did not fly far enough and landed with a crash in the pews. The story is still a joke in the Lake family. Other lakes went in for invention. My grandfather, Lake, made what was perhaps the first practical seed planting machine. His cousin Vincent designed an excellent typewriting machine and was one of the inventors of the old calligraph typewriter. His first machine was shown at an exhibition in Brooklyn not many years ago. Risley Lake, another cousin with his brother Vincent, invented what is now known as the offset device for color printing, and David Lake, we spoke of him always as D, invented the shoe lasting machine, made money out of it, and retired from business as a young man. Ira Lake made a workable telephone when Alexander Graham Bell announced his initial success, and Ira dropped out. My father invented the shade roller for windows and put it on the market about the same time that Hartshorn shade roller was also patented. The Lake and Hartshorn rollers were sufficiently unlike to invite competition, and both men did very nicely for years. Then the patents expired and Hartshorn outsmarted father. Every other man who knew how to add ratchets to round sticks went into the shade roller business, and the market was flooded. After a time, my father gave it up. Hartshorn had plenty of money and kept on. "Buy a Hartshorn roller if you want a good roller," he advertised. Perhaps that was not the phrase he used, but that was the meaning. The men who were new at the business had been using green wood and cheap springs, and their customers were glad to throw away their contraptions and buy the Hartshorn roller. Father had not known how to advertise his business and was ruined. I am afraid that the Lakes are not interested in keeping money after they get it. Most of them have made comfortable livings and have had good homes, but I know of none who have become a multimillionaire, although many have been pioneers in various activities. John Lake was one of the founders of Gravesend, now South Brooklyn, in 1645. His son William Lake took up the land of what is now Atlantic County in South Jersey, and his descendants were active in the development of that section. My great-grandfather surveyed the Shore Road, which for years was the only roadway to the coast from Cape May to South Amboy. As a boy, my grandfather showed me the remains of the wooden floors of the evaporating ponds his father had built, where a rough salt was extracted from the seawater. This is now Atlantic City, but at the time there was not a house on the island, and the only use made of it was as a pasture for cattle. When summer campers discovered it, grandfather and his brothers built the first roadway on the meadows and bridge over the thoroughfare. This was the only means of communication until the railways came, followed by a superb system of boulevards over which the cars stream unendingly today. The Lakes have been active in the temperance movement too, ever since my great-grandfather and Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, traveled together through the country preaching against strong drink. Sometimes the drinkers disagreed with them so violently that they were compelled to call for the protection of the county sheriffs. Pleasantville did not have a licensed saloon for more than 150 years. In 1881, my grandfather owned the island called Peck's Beach, on which Ocean City was built. As a member of the New Jersey legislature, he succeeded in having a law enacted forbidding the sale of liquor or the operation of bawdy houses in Ocean City under penalty of the forfeiture of land on which the offending establishment stood. His death was caused by his activity in protecting the coastline of the island against the storms, which have eroded so many miles of the New Jersey shoreline. He employed many men to cut down brush and rip-rap the waterfront, so that instead of the sand being torn away by the undertow, it was washed up, becoming a part of the solid ground. Many handsome homes now stand on the northern part of the island, which was saved by his forethought. In showing an Italian workman how to handle an axe, he cut his foot one day. Blood poisoning set in, and he died. The temperate and active lives led by most of the Lakes have conferred the blessings of great physical strength and ripe age upon them. My father is 90 years old and still quite vigorous, so I look forward to at least 10 years more of activity. I am also a descendant of Jeremy Adams, one of the founders of Hartford, Connecticut, in 1636. His name appears on the Founders Monument in Hartford. Jeremy was an Indian agent and, by appointment of the king, the keeper of the public inn. His home was torn down, a comparatively few years ago to make room for the buildings of the Travelers Insurance Company. Old Jeremy seems to have been a fast thinker. The colony got into difficulties with the Crown, and it was essential that the original copy of the charter under which the colony was operating be preserved. A meeting of the General Court was being held in Jeremy's Inn, and the charter was laid on the table while the dispute raged. "This room is too hot," said Jeremy. "One of you serving men open the windows." The windows were opened, and the brisk Connecticut wind blew in, extinguishing the candles, and Jeremy tucked the charter under his coat. Perhaps he was suspected, but at all events he was not searched, and later he hid the charter in the charter oak, where it remained in safety. One of the later Adams moved to New Jersey and married into the Lake family. With this background of pioneering, it is perhaps natural that my interests have been more in doing things than in making money. I remember that Frank Miller, the president of City National Bank of Bridgeport, said at a public dinner, "I have known Simon for years and I am fond of him, but he doesn't know the value of $1 or how to keep it after he gets it." "That's probably true," was my reply, but I had rather die broke because I had been spending all my money in doing worthwhile things than sit around cutting coupons. Chapter 3. Befriending the Oyster Pirates. When I first conceived the idea of the submarine, as a schoolboy at Toms River, New Jersey, I was fascinated by the idea of the diving compartment. I felt that if I can step out of my submarine, which was to be, right onto the ocean floor, I would soon be able to outmarvel Verne himself. But I only had the idea. I knew nothing of the air pressures, nor how long it is possible to live and breathe stale air over and over again, nor what it takes to place in air that has been exhausted by overuse. None of the books at my disposition contained any information. No one I knew could tell me anything. It was evident that I must work out my problem myself. Fortunately for me, the means for this was at hand. In those days, the magazine Golden Days was the friend, guide, and instructor of every boy who could scrape together the dollars for a year's subscription, or wheedle his folks into subscribing for him. In each number were suggestions of devices which could be put together by boys, and which, so far as my recollection goes, were always enticing but always dangerous to limb and life. During my residence at Toms River in 1882, the magazine carried elaborate directions for the making of a canvas canoe. I made one and found it the crankiest craft ever put together. If you winked an eye, she either spurted out from under you, or tipped over, or did some other silly thing. But I experimented with her patiently and finally located her center of gravity. After ensuring her static stability by careful ballasting, I managed to have a good deal of fun. It was evident to me that if I tipped over the canoe and held her at the bottom side up, in the water the cavity of her hull would contain a certain quantity of air. My problem was to overrun and then come up under her and see how long I can go on breathing. It appears now that at the time I lacked the passion for exactitude which marks the true scientist, for I do not remember that I had any measure of the air content, and I certainly could not expect my homemade watch to time me accurately after a dive through the water of Toms River. My first research into problems which air presents to the submarine engineer was abruptly ended. My canvas canoe was righted by my strong hand. "What's the matter with ye, Simon?" asked an anxious voice. "Be ye hurt?" My explanation of my purpose in overturning the canoe was only confirmation of what Toms River had long suspected of my intellectual furnishings. But that was no consequence to me. I had been able to live without fresh air for approximately a half an hour, and that gave me a point of departure for my calculations. Before I was 14 years old, I had completed the plans for the first Argonaut. I left them in my father's desk when I went away to school. When I came home again, completely distasteful of schools and teachers and hungry to get my hands on tools, I showed them to him. "They look all right to me, Simon," he said, after he had studied them for a time. "But what's the meaning of this, and this?" I explained the things that had puzzled him. "Let these plans alone for a time, son," he advised. "The best engineers in the world have tried to solve these problems and have failed. Give yourself a little more time." This was not welcome advice, of course. I had no money, for a schoolboy rarely is able to accumulate capital, and no one would back me, and I was wholly possessed by my submarine demon. There was nothing I can do about it except go to work and make money and ultimately carry out my plans. I bluntly refused to go back to school. You should have some technical training, Father said. I would like you to go to good technical school. I want to go into the shop, I stubbornly said. Father had moved his little foundry from Tom's River to Ocean City. The Lake family had founded both Ocean City and Atlantic Highlands as shore resorts with strong religious influences and control, and were not only interested in the temporal success, but in the quantity of their morals. Father thought his little foundry would make money. If it did not, its doors would quickly be closed, and that it would afford employment to about 30 men, thus benefiting the town. Tom Cooney was the boss molder. I could make a molder of the lad, he said, after he watched me work in the foundry for a few days. He was a good man, and he made a first-rate molder of me. I was then 14 years old, and I weighed 141 pounds. I was fast and tireless and filled with young ambition to be the best man in the ship. Pretty soon I had a bench of my own. Then I teamed up with another man who was the fastest in the shop in some operations, just as I was the fastest in others. When we worked together, we can be the best team in the foundry. Then I began to look into higher branches of art. We had a man named Forrester who was a very good pattern maker, and he taught me how to make a gear wheel, which was a test of proficiency. I began to go to Franklin Institute in Philadelphia 3 days a week to study mechanical drawing. I could see that if I were to make a really first-rate submarine, I would know something of many things. When I was 18, my father had to go west on business, and he left me in charge of the foundry. The 30 men had been working for us a long time. They had their homes in Ocean City, other employment was almost non-existent, and their relations with the lakes had been admirably friendly. Neither my father nor I suspected any trouble could possibly come up. But he was hardly out of town when the men staged what we would call nowadays a sit-down strike. One of the men came to me. "We've got to get more money, Simon," he said, "or we quit." The word "Mister" had, I suppose, never been heard inside the foundry walls. Managers and men knew each other by their first names. The other men sat down by their benches and grinned at me. They evidently thought they had the boy by the short hair. If I did not give them the increases they asked for, I would be shown up as an incompetent manager who had his factory shot from under him on his first day in charge. "That's good," I said heartily. "You know just about as much as me about the factory as I do, John. You know we're not making much money, just managing to keep open so the men can have some work and draw some pay. But this gives me a chance to shorten the payroll. I discharge a few of the men right now, and you're the first to go, John." "Wait a minute," said John hurriedly. "Let me talk to the boys." In no time at all, they were all hard at work. Perhaps we lost 10 minutes in the sit-down strike, no more. The men grinned at me now and during the day and then forgot it. As they might say nowadays, anyhow, we tried. You can't blame a fellow for trying. On one occasion, my father called me into his little office. "Simon," he said critically, "your clothes are not very good." They were not, of course. Every waking minute, almost, was being spent in the foundry. I did not need good clothes, but father seemed to think that not exacting standards of the family were being lowered by my dress. "Here is some money," he said. "Go into Philadelphia tomorrow and buy some clothes." I meant well, but my flesh is weak when exposed to the printed word. Before I got around to buying clothes, I stepped into a bookstore to browse around, as clerks say, and came home with plenty of new books but no new clothes. This was one of the really important days of my life. One of the books I bought was Haswell's Mechanics and Engineers Pocketbook, which was to be my Bible for years to come. Charles Haswell was the first chief engineer of the United States Navy, and for more than 40 years, the official measurer of the New York Yacht Club. No other marine engineer of his time could be compared to him. In the opinion of the old salts who demanded facts in the operations were only mildly concerned with the theory. Old-timers would agree that Uncle Charlie was one of the notable men of his day. Haswell's mind operated entirely in mathematical terms. Later he became my first stockholder. "How are you, Uncle Charlie?" someone asked one day. "If I live until Thursday," he replied, "I'll be 98.7. When I got home with my load of books, my father frowned at me mildly. "I'm sorry about the clothes," I explained, "but after I got the books I had to have, there was no money left." I studied Haswell's pocketbook until the dog's eared. The old book is still on my desk even now, and I sometimes refer to it. It was around this time that I first came in contact with the old high-wheel bicycle. The extremely lucky present generation has never used this mechanical beast, and for its information it may be stated that the first practical form the bicycle assumed was that of a very high wheel tailed by a very small wheel. Mounted on top of a high wheel, the venturesome rider kicked vigorously at the pedals. If the high wheel encountered an obstacle suddenly, he fell on his nose and the two wheels fell on him. If at a speed the high wheel hit a rock or a corncob or anything else at an angle, the handlebars twisted out of his hands and he dived sideways into a ditch. It seemed to me that something could be done about this, and in 1887 I patented a steering device which enabled the rider of a high wheel to retain possession of the handlebars even under a considerable twist. An adaptation of the same scheme is used on the steering gear of all automobiles today. If the gear were held without any chance for play when the wheels strike an obstacle, every automobile in the world would be in the ditch. This patent was granted on May 24th, 1887, and I had fairly started on my career as an inventor. Since then, I have had over 200 patents granted to me in the United States and foreign countries. 111 have to do with submarines or their mechanisms. 25 of my patents are now in use on submarines everywhere. Without them, there could be no practical use. My improved steering gear for high-wheel bicycles proved to be practicable. I had sailed a boat from the time I was big enough to haul a rope, and I was familiar with the manner in which a steering wheel fought the helmsman in the heavy sea. I therefore planned an extension of my improved steering gear for small boat use. There was a market anywhere along the Atlantic seaboard, but it seemed to me that a better one might be found in Chesapeake Bay. The bay was at that time producing more and better oysters than any body of water in the world. They were dredged for from the decks of small sailing vessels, and to haul heavy dredges aboard a device known as a winder was used. The I is pronounced as in wine. It consisted of a winch and a winding handle. Not infrequently the dredge would catch on an underwater obstruction as the vessel sailed along, and snatch the handle out of the hands of the many men at work winding. Many a good man has been killed by a blow on a head or chest from the heavy handle. I had a simple little scheme for stopping that backfiring of a handle winding, and I took it and my improved steering gear to Baltimore for sale to the oystermen. This was in 1888. Not long ago, I saw two steering gears that I had put in use on oyster sloops in Baltimore. The operation of putting the safety gear on a steering wheel was not a complicated one, and I used to row out in the bay at night and attach them while the fleet was at anchor. At $35 each, I made a very decent living. I did not realize it then, or if I did, it was just an occasion for laughter, but I was probably the best friend the oyster pirates of Chesapeake Bay ever had. Those were hard days. Morals and ideals had not been burnished to perfection. The oystering business was about as tough as any business you can think of, and the oystering captains were as rough as any men or any bully mates on the American deep-sea clippers. Men employed on the sloops were paid off at the end of the season. If there was a shortage of dredgers, no captain had any hesitancy in shanghaiing as many men as he needed, with the help of the saloon keepers on Boston Street. Some of the worst of the captains were reputed to pay off at the end of the season by jibbing the main boom, a humorous way of saying the men were murdered. My winding gear was noiseless, whereas the clank of the pawls on the old-fashioned winders could be heard for miles on a calm night. The best of the oyster beds were privately owned and protected by guards, and many of the state-owned beds were forbidden to dredgers. These laws were obeyed except by the more desperate of the oyster pirates. But my noiseless gear enabled even the reasonably law-abiding men to drift over a guarded bed and scoop up a sloop load without arousing the law. Many a life has been saved on the Chesapeake Bay by my improved steering gear and my safety-assured winders. But how many million bushels of oysters have been stolen by their aid is anyone's guess. Chapter 4. First Contact with Big Business. I had been living a sheltered life. The Lake family is God-fearing and temperate. The men in my father's family were sound, self-respecting Americans. Tom's River was a village with a dash of sea air, and Ocean City was professedly religious in tone. Profanity and drunkenness were as rare as arson or wife-beating. In Baltimore, I was to have my first contact with the person known as the up-and-coming businessman. I did not like him. I had been making a very satisfactory living with my steering gear and my winders, for the Baltimore oystermen bought as many as I can supply. As the oyster boats could be often worked on only at night, I spent my daytime working at new ideas and made sales and delivered my goods at night. Baltimore was then a canning center, and the A. Booth Company was the largest canner. Booth's canning was done by machine, but it was not satisfactory. 2 machines and a dozen men were needed to cap 15,000 cans a day. I went to see Booth with plans for a new machine. "Show me," said the head of the company. Before I could show, it was necessary to build a machine. As usual, I had not enough money, but I went to New York, enlisted 3 moneyed men, formed the Lake Capping Machine Company, and I thought they were very nice men indeed, for they were kind and hearty to me. As soon as I had shown them my plans and told them my prospects, they agreed to put in $10,000. In return, they were to have control of the company. They told me that this was customary and indeed necessary. An inventor, they explained, could not be expected to be a good businessman. This would relieve me of harassing details of bookkeeping, and I could devote myself to the making of the machines. This seemed a very sound idea to me. All inventors who list the aid of businessmen hear the same story. In most cases, it seems sound to them. My friends actually put in $600 in cash. I was able to draw a salary of $75 a month as soon as I was able to get into production. During the preliminary period of getting ready to go into production, I drew no salary. I do not know how my friendly partners thought I would live during this time, but that was of no consequence. I made my machine and set it up for operation. In the Baltimore canning factories, the men were classed as skilled workers. My machine could cap 50,000 cans a day, and only 2 green boys were needed to supervise it. I was on the highway to fortune, as I thought, but it was turned into a detour. The Cappers Union of Baltimore promised to close any canning factory that adopted my machine. The union would have been helpless. As a matter of fact, for my machine could do the work of 40 men, and no union could stand up against that. But the union bluffed, and the canners capitulated. I was in no position to take an active part, for I had completed but 1 machine, and it capped 1 and 2 pound cans only. The canners wanted machines that would cap 3 pound cans as well. The A. Booth Company was willing to fight the union and contract with me for the machines, but, quite properly, wanted to be certain that I would be in a position to supply the spare parts to make the repairs as needed. The company was fair with me, however. "We will buy the machine you have on hand if you can assure us of protection," said the Booth Company. "Then you can go ahead and manufacture others." I called on my 3 backers for more money. Everything seemed rosy to me, for sales were certain, and what was important to me as an inventor was my machine and getting it into operation. I was so anxious to get ahead and so desirous of lightening the load on my 3 backers that I offered to forget all about my salary until we were able to get into production. 3 days' pay was coming at me this time, or approximately $4. As a businessman, I expected payment of this sum. My backers gave me first of many shocks I have received in dealing with businessmen. "We think it best for you to sell one of the machines you have built to the A. Booth Company," they wrote to me. "This will make the company a very considerable profit, and this money will go into the treasury. Then you can go ahead and build other machines." I replied that A. Booth Company would not buy only a single machine, but I would not sell it if they were foolish enough to buy, for a breakdown would put the company at the mercy of the Cappers Union. Before any sale could be made, the Lake Capping Machine Company must show good faith by producing other capping machines. But my 3 backers refused to go on with their agreement and put up the remainder of $10,000 they had promised. They were so bemused by the opportunity to make large profit on a single sale, which would furnish the backlog for the enterprise at no cost to them whatever, that they were simply unable to see the other factors. So the Lake Capping Machine Company blew up. I never saw them again. They had control of the company, and I was helpless. But they could not make the machines, and they were helpless. The company just died. I was not as much disappointed as one might think. My interest in submarines had never flagged, and it had risen higher than ever because of my association with the Chesapeake Bay oystermen. I had married Miss Margaret Vogel of Baltimore in 1890, and she had encouraged me almost nightly to work on my plans for submarines. All my life it has been my habit to work until midnight, or thereabouts, and not rise until long after dawn. This is not so much a habit of industry as of self-indulgence. I have always been so enormously interested in whatever I am doing that the days are too short for me. I had worked out the scheme for the lake submarine and had decided to name it the Argonaut, if and when I was able to build one. At this time, I had thought of building a submarine for naval use. I was possessed of my original conviction that a submarine built for purely commercial use would be profitable. After 40 years of practical experience, I still think so. One day in 1892, I came home to find my wife tremendously excited. "Look," she said, pointing to an advertisement in one of Baltimore's papers, "the Navy authorities are advertising for bids on a submarine." "If I win the competition," I said to her, "I'll buy you lots of pearls." The Navy Department had listed certain requirements as essential. In the order of importance, they were safety, ease and certainty of operation when submerged, speed, endurance, offensive power, stability, ability to perceive the object to be attacked. For more than a century, the Navy departments of several countries had been examining the possibilities of submarine navigation. In 1863, the French Navy brought out the largest and most efficient submarine boat to be launched during the 19th century. In 1866, Mr. O. S. Halstead of Newark, New Jersey, completed a submarine on which the United States government made a partial payment. The intelligent whale is still to be seen on the green at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Some years later, Mr. J. P. Holland had launched the Fenian Ram, which was designed for use against the British Navy during Ireland's War for Independence. But no satisfactory submarine had been produced, although a number of inventors were at work on plans. "Good luck, Simon," said my wife when she kissed me goodbye the morning I started for Washington to submit my plans. "I'll need it." But I found that I really needed a good many things, and luck was only one of them. When I was finally ushered into the office of the Secretary of the Navy, my heart sank low. Here I was, a green youngster of 27. I felt about 14 years old that morning in the presence of more important men than I had ever seen in my life. No one sat at the secretary's desk, although from time to time orderlies placed papers on it or took others away. But the great room was filled with men who might have been anything, only provided it was big enough. Those were the days of frock coats in official life, and whiskers and cable chains stretching across low-cut vests and large and impressive hats. I sat on a divan and rolled up my plans in my hand and felt my insignificance grow on me. A young man sitting beside me spoke in a friendly way. "I suppose you're the submarine inventor, too," he said, nodding towards my roll of plans. "Are all these men inventors of submarines?" I asked. "Oh, no. So far as I know, 3 are here, you and my father, Mr. George A. Baker of Chicago, and Mr. John P. Holland of New York. But who are all these other men?" The young man knew his way around. He named senators and congressmen and lawyers and the politicians whose names were familiar to me, although I had been taking not the slightest interest in politics. "There is one of the great New York bankers," said my acquaintance, pointing out a man who was buttonholing a senator. They seemed to be on the most intimate terms. There were promoters and brokers moving through the crowd. The air was filled with tobacco smoke and noise, and everyone there seemed to wear an air of dominance and authority. Those who glanced at me seemed not even to see me. I felt of less consequence than a page boy. "Lakey," I said to myself, "the church may be right, but you're in the wrong pew." After a time, I was permitted to submit my plans. No one seemed to be at all interested in them or me. No one wanted to talk to me or ask any questions. Later, I was to learn that the inventors are not highly regarded in government offices. This is said in no spirit of criticism, for it is a fact that many crack brains develop inventions and talk a witless jargon that is incomprehensible to the trained intellect and a violent annoyance to the unfortunate clerk who is compelled to listen. Inasmuch as inventors do invent things, and as all progress may be traced to inventions, however, it has always seemed to me that the government should make an intelligent effort to sift out those who have something from many who have nothing. I will have more to say of this after a while. "That is all for today," said the naval officer who had received my plans. "The department will communicate with you later." I was confident that my plans were so superior to those of Holland and Baker. Every inventor presumably feels that way. I could name several points of superiority. It seemed to me, too, that in my almost infantile ignorance of how things are done in politics, that my proposition would appeal to the chiefs of the Navy Department. I had not submitted a bid for the construction of a boat, for a very good reason, that I had neither money nor backers, but I had asked that, if my plans were accepted, I be given a position in the capacity of constructor, and my boat be built in one of the Navy yards. It seemed to me that this suggestion was both practical and a promise of economy. What I did not know was that there was a smell of business in the building of submarines. Let me emphasize this statement. It is not necessarily critical. The friends of Mr. Baker and Mr. Holland, one or both, had aroused interest in submarines among members of Congress. An appropriation of $200,000 was made, and it was a very natural feeling of those who had put this appropriation through that Baker and Holland were entitled to the first chance at it. I went back to Baltimore hoping to hear from Washington on almost every mail. Nothing came from Washington, but one day I got a telegram from the editor of the New York Tribune. "Understand, Navy Board has approved your plans," something like that, "and Lake Submarine will be built. Will you see reporter for the Tribune in Baltimore?" I gave that interview with the Tribune, but Mr. Holland got the contract. Years later I met Admiral Baird, who had been a member of the Navy Board. This was after I had built successful submarines for Russia and Austria and had been engaged in advisory capacities by other governments. Krupps of Germany had contracted with me also, but the company took advantage of technical opportunity to slip out of the agreement, and while it was building submarines of the Lake type, it built them on its own. Baird said, "Lake, I'm glad to meet you. We should have been building your boats all the time. 4 of the 5 members of the board voted for your plans in 1893, you know. Then why didn't you build my boats?" "Because the Navy advertisement had required that a bid submitted for the construction of a submarine. You made no such bid. 4 of us," he continued, "wanted to call you over to the Navy Yard and have you make up a working drawing. Then we could build in one of the Navy yards under your supervision, but they beat us. My plans had called for a boat which had been since come known as the level keel or submersible type, the only type of submarine now being built. The Holland boats were submerged by the operation of a horizontal rudder placed at the stern of the boat, and the Baker boats by the use of side propellers which could be inclined up or down. The Holland boat was at the time called a diving boat, and was similar to boats which had been built by the Confederates during our Civil War and by French, Spanish, and English inventors. They had all dived like a fish, and sometimes quite as unexpectedly. Many such boats have in this way taken the lives of their crews. In fact, this type of vessel could not be controlled except by the frequent juggling of diving rudders, and frequently the most expert helmsman would fail to catch her in time to keep her from broaching, or perhaps running her nose into the bottom. One of the German diving type drove herself 45 feet into the mud on the bottom of Kiel Harbor, and it took a battleship to pull her out. A French naval observer, after watching a trial of one of the early French submarines, Le Plongeur, described her progress like a rubber ball bounding along, alternately striking the bottom and then rebounding in the air. The advocates of this diving type termed this alternative diving and broaching porpoising, and they tried to claim a credit for such performance, but their boats could not be controlled. Men had to take fixed positions when the boats ran submerged, hold on like barnacles to a pier, to keep from being thrown and possibly injured. With my level keel boat, I was able to maintain sufficient stability to permit the men of the crew to move about at will, and to fire torpedoes without the nose of the submarine being jumped out of the water. The Holland Company had guaranteed a performance for the plunger, which was not only not met at the time, but which no boat ever built has ever been able to meet. But the art of building submarines was then in its puling infancy. A few skeptics like myself might be found who could place their criticism of the Holland boat on a scientific ground, but there were only a few. The extent of ignorance even in professional circles can hardly be understood, now that submarines have become naval commonplace. Along with this ignorance was a quality of stupid arrogance, which made the life of an unfortunate inventor an unhappy one. The feeling of too many officers was that a mere civilian should not presume to challenge any position that they might take. On one occasion, I attempted to discuss my Argonaut with a graduate of the Naval Academy at Annapolis, who was in charge of certain phases of naval construction. "My Argonaut can do thus and so," I said. "That's impossible," he said brusquely. "Why do you try to make me believe a thing like that?" "But it is not impossible." I felt as though my breath had been beaten out of my body, for a thing I had been describing was a commonplace of any day's run. "I have done it. I do it every day. I will prove it to you any day, and you will come on board." "I tell you it's impossible," he snapped angrily. "I am an expert, and I know." "But I've done it," I repeated. "Don't bother me any more," he said. "I'm busy. I've got my letters to get out." Yet the thing I had done, the possibility of which he denied, was commonplace to any intelligent student of advanced physics, and is being done on every submarine built today. Chapter 5. Repulsed by the Navy. When I learned that the Holland Company had been given the contract to build a submarine for the Navy, and that Simon Lake's plans had been thrown in the basket, I lost my temper. Nature had not given me red hair for nothing. It was not that I felt any personal pique. The Navy experts could do what they pleased with Simon Lake and be blessed to them. But when they overlooked my evidently superior craft in favor of one I knew would not work, I was infuriated. The best of it is that I was right. My submarine, when it was built, did everything I claimed for it. The plans I submitted in 1893 contained several features that were new in submarine designing. Previous planners had concentrated on the underwater capabilities of their boats. It had seemed to me that it was also important that a submarine should be able to sail on the surface, and should be fairly comfortable for her crew. A more or less helpless hunk would in the end prove nothing more than a sporting target for a surface ship of war, and a crew that suffered unduly might be willing to surrender and get away from misery. This may not be an idealistic way of looking at humanity, but it is not nonsense. Therefore I had planned a vessel that could not only sail comfortably on the surface, but could make progress beneath the surface at any desired depth. The distance below the surface was controlled by what I called regulating vanes, or hydroplanes. After the proper depth had been reached by emitting water to the water ballast compartments, these planes keep the vessel on an absolutely even keel. A moment's reflection will show the superiority of this method over that used in Holland's plunger, which would have progressed by a series of uncontrollable leaps and bounds to the intense discomfort and even danger of her crew. This was demonstrated in other vessels of the plunger type. Nor was my vessel, which was to have been named the Argonaut, to be overfilled with machinery. When it was finally constructed, it proved to be very livable. A feature of the plans submitted to the Navy Department was that retractable wheels were provided, which made it possible to move over the sea bottom with ease and certainty. The wheels were to prove eminently satisfactory in practice, but they were called a dangerous defect when the Naval Board examined my plans in 1893. Imagine, one eloquent speaker is said to have urged the board, the sad fate of the crew of a lake submarine if, in moving blindly over the bottom of the sea, it were suddenly to run over the lip of a precipice. Nothing would have happened, of course. A lake submarine at the bottom of the sea is given negative buoyancy. That is, it balances its water ballast and air content until it is just the least little bit less than buoyant, and so it is enabled to stay on the bottom. If it were to run over the edge of a precipice, as the terror-stricken orator imagined, it would merely float slowly towards the bottom. The expulsion of the smallest quantity of water would start it rising again. But because no one before me had offered to attach wheels to the bottom of a submarine, the suggestion seemed unnatural and dismaying. The so-called experts could not open their minds widely enough to take it in. Of course, there were no experts on submarining then, for there were no working submarines. Another feature of the lake boat was that a safety chamber was included, affording means by which the crew could leave the submarine in case of disaster. It also provided a double keel, which could be released at will, thereby increasing the flotation capacity of the boat. Other features which are to be found in the successful submarine boats of today were planned for it. It will hardly be held against me, I think, that I got my dander up when the naval board turned me down. It is not likely that I used modern slang, but I said what any angry modern would say. I'll show 'em. There was but one way, and that was by building a submarine which could do all I said my Argonaut would. I could see I must produce evidence the value of which could not be denied if I were to get anywhere. It was obvious that I could not build a submarine for the Navy, for the Navy did not want it. I neither had the money nor influence available for an attempt on the navies of other countries. The one thing I could do, if I could get the money, was to build a submarine for commercial purposes. That was what I had always wanted to do, anyway. Not until my wife saw the advertisement in the Baltimore paper had I ever paid attention to the possibilities of submarine use in war. It was the thought of reaping the treasures of the sea, more accurately, of the sea bottom, that had fascinated me. New York, then as in now, was the money center of the country. I'm going to New York and raise money, I told my wife. I'll build my Argonaut. Fine, Simon, she said. That's what you should do. My father had come to Baltimore to help me with my business and improve steering devices and dredging gear winders, and I proposed to leave him in charge of the establishment while I attacked the Citadel. Before I can get away from New York, it was necessary to tie up a number of loose ends, of course, and before they had all been knotted, I read a paragraph in the Baltimore papers to the effect that the Navy Department might be reopening the competition for submarine building. Hope springs eternal in the breast of an inventor, I said to myself. At least the chance has come. Then I reflected that when the bids were opened the first time, I had not managed my affairs with any skill. No one knew me, and everyone knew the Messrs. Holland and Baker, who had been active through their friends in getting primary appropriation of $200,000 through Congress. I had walked into the office of the Secretary of the Navy, a greenhorn, with a roll of papers in my hand, and I received precisely the consideration I might have expected. This time, I said to myself, I'll do as the others do. I will make myself known. I asked Governor Leon Abbott of New Jersey, who knew the Lake family and me, very well indeed, for a letter of introduction to the gentleman who was then acting Secretary of the Navy. Armed with this letter, my roll of plans, and every morsel of fact which had to do with submarines ready under my tongue, I visited Washington again. Perhaps I had not thoroughly learned my lesson as the proper method or procedure in dealing with politicians. Maybe some signaling and semaphoring should have gone before. At all events, I walked into the office of the acting secretary and handed Governor Abbott's letter to a smiling colored man. The secretary will see you in a few minutes, he reported. Won't you sit down? There were others in the anteroom. We sat on the hard chairs of the government, which they provided to the suppliants waiting on dignity, twiddled our fingers, eyed each other anxiously, and now and then exchanged remarks in whispers. Hours passed. At last, the acting secretary, dressed in his little brief authority, appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry to keep you waiting, he said to the assemblage, but I'm going to lunch. I'll see you at 2:30. At 2:30 he reappeared and walked quickly around the room, shaking hands with all and exchanging words with few. When he came to see me, I said, I am Simon Lake. I sent in to you a letter of introduction from Governor Leon Abbott of New Jersey. Yes, said the acting secretary brightly. Governor Abbott is a good friend of mine. I shall be glad to talk with you a little later, but just for now you must excuse me. In a few minutes I will send for you. At 4:00 he reappeared in the doorway and said, I am sorry, gentlemen, but I will not be able to see any of you today, for I must sign my mail. I did not know then that there is usually more than one door to a politician's office in Washington, and that the callers he wishes to see rarely run the gauntlet of public appearance in the anteroom. At 9:00 the following morning I was on hand again. The same colored man met me with the same bright, kindly smile. The colored messengers in Washington are at least able to wear the appearance of sincerity and kindness. I told him that I was still waiting for the interview with the acting secretary, and that I had sent a letter from the governor of New Jersey to that official. The colored man returned from the visit to the inner temple. "He'll see you in just a few minutes, sir." At noon, the acting secretary again appeared in the door to make the announcement of the day before. "I am going to lunch. I will return at 2:30. By this time, my blood was beginning to circulate pretty fast. Everyone who had been in the anteroom when I first arrived had either had his interview or had been passed on in some other way. A new crowd was on hand. I could imagine that some of them were grinning behind their hands at the way I had been treated, for I saw that I was getting what the young folks of today call the runaround. I followed the acting secretary into the hall, and he noticed, perhaps, that the storm signals were flying. He put his hand on my shoulder. "I am sorry to have kept you waiting this way," he said, "but as soon as I get back from lunch, I will take you up on your matter." This time his word was kept. He took up my matter, but unfortunately for me, he dropped it again. He heard the few words I had to say and then sent for one of his colored messengers. "Take Mr. Lake to see Captain Sampson," he ordered. "Tell him that Mr. Lake has come to me with a letter from the governor of my state, and that he has something of great importance to say about submarines. Tell Captain Sampson to listen to what he has to say and then report to me. I am greatly interested." I was elated as I marched down the long corridor in the wake of the colored man. But instead of taking me to the future Admiral Sampson, he turned me over to another messenger and did not repeat the message the acting secretary had given him. After a time, the second messenger came back from a visit to Sampson's office. "The captain will see you now." First I was taken before Sampson's clerk and put through an examination. Perhaps I did not impress him, for there were no evidences of interest in Sampson's attitude. When I was finally ushered into his private office, I began to tell him of my boat and its possibilities. He deliberately turned his back to me, put his feet on a chair, looked out of the window, and in the most bored tones conceivable, said, "Oh, all right, go ahead, but make it short." By this time I had lost my enthusiasm. I had been treated to one cold douche after another, and was fairly tongue-tied. After I had made the least convincing statement in the world to Sampson's chilly back, I picked up my hat, walked out of the room, and vowed that I would never return until I was sent for, and I never did. In the end, the Navy Department wanted me very badly indeed. I returned to Baltimore about as angry as a red-headed man can be. It was evident that I had been deliberately insulted, and I could not understand why. It seemed to me that any citizen should at least be received with courtesy by the officials of our government. Years later, I had some legal business in New York, and as the former acting secretary had opened a law office there, I called on him and asked him to undertake it. "Yes, I am free now. I can take care of it for you. I met you before once," I remarked, "when you were acting secretary of the Navy." He looked at me queerly and said, "I remember your visit very well indeed. You must have thought I gave you a very cavalier treatment." "I did think so. There's an explanation," said the former acting secretary. "Before I accepted the post of Assistant Secretary of the Navy, I was acting secretary when we met. I had been the attorney for the company which proposed to build submarine boats. I knew they had spent large sums of money and that their offices were quite confident that their boats would be successful. I gave up that connection before I went to the Navy Department, of course, but it is probable that my knowledge of their affairs and my former association with them led me to give you less consideration than you were entitled to. I went to New York in 1894. I had a few $100s, complete faith in my plans for the construction of a submarine to be used for commercial purposes, no acquaintances at all, and not a glimmer of an idea of the manner in which money is raised for new ventures. My brother-in-law, C.E. Adams, took me to live with his family at Bayonne, and I rented a small office in the old Cheeseboro building at 24 State Street. Gene Adams was the assistant cashier at Pier 1 in the North River. Ultimately, he gave up his job to come with me and has been a close and valued associate for over 30 years. The passage of time has taken the sting out of my experiences in New York, and now they are actually funny to me. At the moment, they were heartbreaking. I wanted desperately to prove that my hoped-for submarine would be all that I claimed for it, but it was not that I was a salesman, and after my experience with the Lake Canning Machine Company, I was wary of getting into the power of other men. I put an advertisement in the papers without result. Then I started on what was to be a door-to-door canvass of the financial district in New York City.